On an April afternoon in 1966, on a windswept stretch of the Canary Islands standing in for the dawn of the world, a photographer took a single picture of a 25-year-old actress sewn into a fur bikini she had not chosen and could barely move in. She was not the star of the film. She had perhaps 2 words of invented dialogue in the entire picture. And yet that one photograph, printed and reprinted in newspapers on 5 continents, months before anyone had even seen the movie it was meant to advertise, would outlive the film, outlive the decade, and very nearly outlive the woman inside it. For the rest of her life, Raquel Welch would be measured against an image that had been developed once, in a dark room she never entered, and never fully retouched to show what else was standing in the frame. She spent the following 5 decades trying to convince an industry that had built its fortune on that single exposure that there was more to the negative than it had chosen to print. Whether she ever succeeded, or whether the picture simply won, is the real question behind the sex symbol, the lawsuits, and the long, quiet unraveling of what actually happened to Raquel Welch. Welcome to her story. She entered the world, appropriately enough, as a first draft nobody had quite finished editing. Born Jo Raquel Tejada on the 5th of September 1940 in Chicago, she was the eldest of 3 children born to Armando Carlos Tejada Urquizo, a Bolivian-born aeronautical engineer who had come north from La Paz as a teenager, and Josephine Sarah Hall, a Midwestern Presbyterian who traced her family, by the household's own telling, back to the Mayflower. It was an unlikely pairing for its era, and Raquel would spend a remarkable portion of her career quietly cropping the Bolivian half of that inheritance out of her own public picture. A decision that followed her onto film sets where directors mocked the accent she didn't actually have and cast her, again and again, as anything except what she was. The family moved to San Diego when she was 2, and she grew up in a household that valued propriety over spectacle, attending Presbyterian services every Sunday with a mother who would have been horrified had she been able to see it coming, by the image her daughter was about to become world famous for. Welch herself later admitted, with a candor that rarely made it into the fan magazines, that she had been an anxious, unremarkable child, not the sort of girl people stopped to look twice at. She trained in ballet for a decade starting at 7, holding a pose the way a subject holds still for a long exposure, until at 17 her own instructor told her, without much ceremony, that she did not have the physique for a professional dance career. It was the first time somebody with authority over her future looked closely and decided the picture wasn't good enough. It would not be the last. It would, before her life was over, become the entire plot. She found a faster route to being looked at in beauty pageants, collecting a string of local titles by 14, Miss Photogenic, Miss Contour, Fairest of the Fair at the San Diego County Fair, and eventually Maid of California. Asked once why she thought she had kept winning, she gave an answer that was almost startlingly unglamorous. She did not think she had been the prettiest girl in any of those rooms. She thought she had simply been trained, since childhood, to walk properly in heels, a small mechanical skill none of the other girls had bothered to practice, and that this, not any accident of bone structure, was what the judges had actually been rewarding. It is a strange thing for a future sex symbol to say about her own beauty, crediting discipline over nature, technique over gift, and it is the first sign of something that would define her entire career. An insistence that the picture the world kept taking of her was the product of enormous, deliberate labor, even as everyone around her preferred to believe it had simply developed on its own. High school ended with 2 exposures at once. Her parents divorced, and she married her high school boyfriend, James Welch, in 1959, taking a surname she would keep for the rest of her life, regardless of how many husbands came after him. She left San Diego State within a year of a theater scholarship, had a son, Damon, in 1959, and a daughter, Tani, in 1961, and rarely discussed the marriage afterward, beyond a single guarded admission that James Welch had not treated her well. By 1962, the couple had separated, and for a period afterward, almost nobody in Hollywood knew that the emerging pinup had been a wife and a mother of 2 years before anyone had photographed her at all. It is worth sitting with how completely she managed to keep that negative undeveloped, out of circulation, for as long as she needed to. What followed was hardly glamorous. Newly single with 2 small children, she scraped by in Dallas, modeling for Neiman Marcus and waitressing cocktails, a stretch of her life she never dressed up in later interviews. She returned to Los Angeles in 1963 and met the man who would build the darkroom around her, Patrick Curtis, a former child actor turned talent executive who understood, better than almost anyone else in the business at the time, that a career could be manufactured through the sheer repetition of a controlled image. He put her through voice and dance lessons, arranged photo sessions at tennis courts and swimming pools and beaches, and treated the whole enterprise, in his own words to the press, as an honest business with an honest aim. Welch, characteristically, refused to be a passive subject in her own development. She insisted on knowing the occasion, the mood, the wardrobe, and the expectations before any appearance, managing the exposure herself rather than leaving it to chance. It is the same instinct that had made her practice her walk in heels years before anyone told her to. Control over the picture, established here at the very start, is the thread that runs under everything that follows, including the disaster still 2 decades away. The machine worked faster than anyone could have guessed. A minor role in the Elvis Presley picture Roostabout in 1964 led to a small part in an adaptation of Polly Adler's memoir, and by October Life magazine had already run her in a feature on Hollywood's rising faces. She tested unsuccessfully for Gilligan's Island and was seriously considered for the role of Domino in Thunderball, the closest she would ever come to the Bond franchise she is still, decades later, misremembered as having belonged to. The part went to Claudine Auger instead. What she landed was a supporting role in Fantastic Voyage, playing a medical assistant aboard a submarine miniaturized to travel through a patient's bloodstream. A film that won an Academy Award for its effects, while one television critic remarked, not kindly, that its intellectual content never rose above her figure. Off-camera, in a detail almost nobody wrote about at the time, she developed real feelings for her co-star Stephen Boyd, feelings the Irish actor never returned, a small private disappointment tucked inside a very public triumph. It was the first frame in a pattern that would define her critical reception for the next decade, praised extravagantly for the surface, and dismissed almost as a formality for everything underneath it. Fox signed her to an unusually generous non-exclusive contract, and Curtis took her to Europe to widen the exposure. By the summer of 1966, she had appeared on the covers of dozens of European magazines, and Fox, sensing what it had, loaned her to Hammer Films in England for a prehistoric adventure picture called 1 Million Years BC. And there, on that windswept location shoot, came the photograph the whole story keeps circling back to. Welch in a fur bikini, sewn onto her for the day, immortalized in a single publicity still that circled the globe before the film itself was even released, and that would end up, decades later, taped to a prison cell wall in the Shawshank Redemption, outliving the picture it was meant to promote by an absurd margin. Welch pushed back, gently but consistently, on the idea that she had simply been exhibiting herself. What she said she was reaching for was not overt sexiness, but something closer to an inner sensuality, the quality she admired in Sophia Loren, a distinction critics rarely bothered to grant her credit for making. A stranger picture came out of this same stretch of her life, taken by the photographer Terry O'Neill, Welch crucified on a cross, still in the fur bikini. An image she had specifically requested his help staging because she was afraid the press would savage her for so much exposed skin, and wanted, for once, to control how that judgment was framed before it could be printed without her. O'Neill, worried the photograph might read as sacrilege rather than the commentary on public judgment it was meant to be, held it back from publication for more than 30 years. It is worth pausing here on just how wildly the same negative got printed by different hands during these years. The New York Times, reviewing 1 million years BC, called her a marvelous breathing monument to womankind, praise so grand it verged on parody. Time magazine, reviewing Fathom only a year later, decided she was less a living, breathing person than an antiseptic doll that had wandered in from the wrong department of the store, and Roger Ebert handed the same film one of the rare 0-star reviews of his career. Both notices were describing the same woman working at the peak of the same fame, photographed by the same industry machinery, and neither critic felt any particular need to reconcile the contradiction. It did not much matter, in the end, which print any given publication chose to run. What mattered was that the negative itself, the actual discipline and craft she had spent a decade building, was rarely what anyone was actually developing an opinion about at all. There was, running underneath all of this, a boundary she never once let the camera cross, and it is worth naming precisely because the industry so rarely credited her for holding it. In 1969's 100 Rifles, a western built deliberately around an interracial romance with the former football star Jim Brown, at a time when the subject still carried genuine commercial risk for a studio picture, the production pushed hard for full nudity in a water tower shower scene meant to distract enemy soldiers on a passing train. Welch refused, as she refused for the whole of her career, and the scene was shot around the limit she set rather than through it. The publicity machine, meanwhile, focused almost entirely on rumors of an off-screen romance between Welch and Brown. Rumors that may well have been amplified for exactly that publicity value. The affair she did have during the production, by most later accounts, was with a Spanish co-star, one her husband Curtis reportedly discovered and responded to by chasing the man through their hotel with a gun, an anecdote that has circulated in profiles of her for years without her ever confirming it herself. A decade later, in 1979, she finally posed for Playboy, again declining a fully nude shoot, and Hugh Hefner himself said afterward that she belonged to the last generation of sex symbols who could be considered the sexiest woman in the world without ever taking her clothes off, adding that he had yielded to her limit gracefully because the pictures proved her point. It is easy to read that restraint as simple modesty. It reads just as plausibly as the same instinct that had her interrogating Curtis about the occasion and the wardrobe before every appearance, an insistence that she, and not the industry, would decide which negative got developed and which stayed in the drawer. She married Curtis in Paris in February 1967, arriving in a see-through crocheted dress that nearly caused a riot among the assembled photographers. A moment that captured, better than almost anything else in her career, how completely the line between the woman and the image had already dissolved. The films that followed were mostly unmemorable, an art house misfire opposite Marcello Mastroianni that even sympathetic critics called an embarrassment, a spy picture Fathom that earned her some grudging praise for range, a glittering cameo in Bedazzled, a supporting turn in a heist comedy where her chronic lateness led her veteran co-star Edward G. Robinson to threaten, without much patience, to cut her out of every close-up if she didn't show up on time, a threat that reportedly corrected the behavior overnight. It was during Fathom 2 that she clashed openly with her co-star Anthony Franciosa and refused, when asked about it, to smooth the story over the way an actress was generally expected to. She was not trying to win a popularity contest, she told one reporter, and she did not think it was possible to be an individual in this business while also trying to please everyone. It is a defiant thing to say out loud in 1967, and it cost her exactly what you would expect: a reputation, quietly built film by film, as difficult. A year later, working with Frank Sinatra on Lady in Cement, she found something closer to an ally, calling him afterward the most raw talent and magnetism of any man she had ever met, even while admitting the film itself wasn't very good. With people she respected, her directness read as camaraderie. With people she found controlling, the same directness read as a diva. The industry, given the choice between the two stories, told the second one almost exclusively, and it is the story that stuck. Two decisions in 1967 show exactly how clearly she understood the picture she was fighting. Fox offered her the lead in an adaptation of Jacqueline Susann's Valley of the Dolls, and she turned it down. An act of refusal so unusual for a contract player that the studio suspended her outright. The role went to Sharon Tate instead. Her reasoning, given plainly to the press, was that she did not want to spend her career playing a woman whose only function was to be looked at. Asked whether she resented being compared to Marilyn Monroe, who had voiced almost identical frustrations before her death, Welch said she did not envy Monroe at all, that Monroe had been desperately unhappy, convinced she was liked only for her physical appeal, and that this was a dangerous position for any woman, because a photograph does not age, but a face does. It is a startlingly clear-eyed thing to say in 1967, years before the industry had any real language for what she was describing. And it recasts the rest of her career, spent fighting the exact trap she had just diagnosed out loud as something closer to a losing argument conducted in public for 30 years. That argument reached its strangest staging ground in 1970, in the production of Myra Breckinridge, Fox's adaptation of Gore Vidal's novel about a man who becomes, through surgery, the most beautiful woman in the world and sets out for revenge on the Hollywood system that made her. Welch took the title role for a reported $200,000, telling reporters it was the first substantial part she had ever been handed and that she intended to use it to prove there was more to her than the campy sex symbol the studio kept developing. The production became a byword for chaos, a director who spent hours alone contemplating scenes while the cast waited, a budget that ran $1 million over, and a legal storm over archival footage spliced in without the original actor's permission. At the center of it sat a feud with Mae West, the 77-year-old former sex symbol, lured out of retirement, who held a contractual clause reserving the right to wear black and white exclusively for herself. When Welch turned up in a black dress trimmed with white ruffle, the dispute escalated until Welch reportedly dyed the ruffle pale blue, so it would read as white on camera, without technically breaking the clause. Newcomer Farrah Fawcett, making her film debut, found herself caught literally between the two women, changing her hair color to satisfy both stars before settling on a shade splitting the difference. The film was received about as badly as a film can be received, and Vidal himself later disowned the adaptation entirely. It should have ended her. Instead, because the reviews were so uniformly savage that no single performance stood out as the culprit, she survived it and moved into a decade of smaller, occasionally sharper work. Some of that decade deserves more credit than it usually gets. In 1972, she starred in Kansas City Bomber as a tough, striving roller derby skater and single mother. A Performance Life magazine called the hottest thing on wheels, breaking her wrist mid-shoot performing her own stunts, and using the 6-week production delay to fly to Budapest for a cameo in Bluebeard opposite Richard Burton, rather than simply rest. That December, she made her nightclub debut at the Las Vegas Hilton, in the slot immediately preceding Elvis Presley's own show. A booking that says as much about her drawing power as any film credit could. It was also the year her marriage to Curtis finally ended, worn down less by any single betrayal than by years of two people who had built a business together long before they built a marriage, and who eventually could not keep the two negatives from bleeding into one another. Afterwards, she was linked, briefly and publicly, to the football star Joe Namath and the producer Robert Evans. Relationships the tabloids photographed far more thoroughly than they were ever allowed to understand, which suited Welch, who had spent a decade already deciding exactly how much of her private life the public got to develop. The following year brought the closest thing to formal validation her industry ever gave her. A Golden Globe for her comic performance in The Three Musketeers in 1973, the single highest honor of her career, for a role playing the Queen's dressmaker rather than the ornamental lead the studios usually built around her. She turned down other chances that might have changed the critical record entirely, including the lead in Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, a part that went on to win Ellen Burstyn an Oscar the following year. In 1976, she took a role in Mother Jugs and Speed as an ambulance dispatcher promoted to MT, a plotline that quietly argued for equal pay between men and women doing the same job. A strikingly progressive note for a mainstream comedy to sound in the mid-1970s, one almost nobody credited her for choosing. Television, meanwhile, let her develop a sense of humor about her own image that the film industry never permitted. A 1970 CBS special with John Wayne, Bob Hope, and Tom Jones, in which she performed an affectionate parody of Mae West herself, a duet with Cher. A Muppet Show number with Miss Piggy, a leather-clad turn as an alien bounty hunter on Mork and Mindy. It is one of the quiet ironies of her career that some of the sharpest commentary on the Raquel Welch persona came from Raquel Welch, delivered on variety shows rather than in the serious dramatic roles she kept asking for and rarely received. Off-camera during these same years, she was, by her own description, a far quieter person than any of it suggested. A registered conservative who credited her mother's Midwestern values for the politics. An outspoken supporter of the Vietnam War at a moment when almost none of her Hollywood peers were. And a regular presence on Bob Hope's USO tours entertaining American troops, a set of loyalties the photograph never once captured and that the fan magazines had no interest in developing. One picture from this stretch of her career did eventually get developed correctly, just decades later than anyone involved could have predicted. In 1971, she starred in Hanny Calder, a low-budget revenge western shot in Spain that came and went with barely a ripple of attention at the time, largely forgotten for the next 30 years. It resurfaced in the most unlikely place imaginable when Quentin Tarantino named it, publicly and repeatedly, as a direct inspiration for Kill Bill, a film whose entire premise, a lone woman methodically hunting down the men who wronged her, is essentially Hanny Calder's plot restaged for a new generation. It is a strange kind of vindication, arriving only after the negative had been sitting in a drawer for 3 decades, proof that the picture had been worth developing properly all along, even if almost nobody bothered to look at it the first time it was printed. Which brings the story to the picture that finally did not develop the way anyone expected. In October 1982, on the first morning of shooting Cannery Row in Monterey, MGM removed her from the leading role and replaced her with Deborah Winger, 15 years her junior. The studio's stated reason, that she had violated her contract by insisting on doing her own hair and makeup at home rather than on set, was thin even by the standards of Hollywood pretexts, and it arrived after she had already agreed, for the first time in her career, to perform nude scenes she had refused for 2 decades. A concession the studio had specifically requested and then discarded along with everything else. Welch's legal team argued instead that the studio had used her name to secure financing for the picture while planning, from the beginning, to swap her out once the money was in place. She put it more bluntly herself, years later, telling the Hollywood Reporter that they had used her to get the film financed and then dumped her for Winger, who they had been planning to cast all along. She filed suit for $24 million, and the case dragged on for more than 5 years, an unusually long fight for a confrontation most studios expected to settle quietly. Since actors almost never won these disputes and studios treated the occasional lawsuit as a routine cost of doing business. In June 1986, a jury sided with her, finding MGM and its collaborators liable for breach of contract, conspiracy, slander, and bad faith, and awarding roughly $10 million in combined damages, with the studio's former president held personally liable on a separate defamation count over comments he had made about her to a magazine. An appeals court upheld the verdict in 1988. Welch ended up earning more from a film she never appeared in than MGM made from releasing it, and yet, as she admitted afterward, the victory cleared her name without repairing her career. She never starred in another major studio film again. For once in her life, the picture she had fought to develop honestly, on the studio's own terms, at the cost of a limit she had held for 20 years, was the one the industry refused to print at all. She spent her later decades trying, with mixed success, to reconcile the woman with the photograph. She married the French-American producer Anne de Weinfeld in 1980, survived a miscarriage in early 1983 she rarely discussed publicly, and divorced him a decade later. A brief marriage to restaurateur Richie Palmer in the late 1990s ended much the same way. She built a business out of the one asset the industry never stopped valuing, publishing a best-selling fitness book and video series in 1984. At a moment when almost no other actress of her generation had thought to turn her own upkeep into a product line rather than a private discipline. She received her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1994, published an autobiography that spent as much time on her children and her marriages as on the image its title referenced, and in her final decades finally accepted the Hispanic heritage she had spent most of her career cropping out of the frame, taking roles in PBS's American Family and the film Tortilla Soup that she said, plainly, she wished had come to her sooner, and receiving an Imogen Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award in 2001 for exactly that late reckoning. A supporting turn opposite Reese Witherspoon in Legally Blonde in 2001 introduced her, unexpectedly, to an audience 2 generations removed from the fur bikini, and her final film role arrived in 2017, more than 50 years after her debut. A working life considerably longer than the industry that fired her in 1982 ever seemed to expect. Underneath all of it, largely unphotographed, was the private picture she guarded most carefully of all. She remained, for the whole of her adult life, a devoted member of a small Presbyterian congregation in Glendale, attending services the way her mother once had, and she described herself in interviews as understated in private. Someone who disliked the hoopla that surrounded the version of her the public consumed. Her daughter Tani grew up to build a career of her own in the same industry, including, not without a certain irony that Welch herself pointed out, some of the very same magazine pages her mother had once posed for decades earlier. The negative developing itself again in the next generation almost against its own will. Welch rarely spoke of her son Damon or her first husband James Welch in public at all, keeping that earliest, least photographed chapter of her life exactly as undeveloped in her 70s as she had kept it in her 20s. A discipline that had not softened with age or fame or 4 subsequent marriages. It is perhaps the clearest evidence available that the control she exercised over her own image was never simply vanity. It was a skill, practiced for 60 years, and she never once let it lapse. She died at home in Los Angeles on the 15th of February 2023 of cardiac arrest, having spent her final years living with Alzheimer's disease at the age of 82. The obituaries reached, understandably, for the same negative that had been developed almost 60 years earlier, the fur bikini, the pin-up, the woman who succeeded Marilyn Monroe as the era's defining sex symbol, without ever fully undressing on screen. It is not an inaccurate print. It is simply the only one the industry ever bothered to run. The same underexposure that had followed her since a photographer's assistant zipped her into a fur costume on a windswept hillside in 1966 and produced, almost by accident, the single image an entire career would be measured against for the rest of her life. It is tempting, telling the story this way, to make the industry the sole villain of the piece. And there is plenty in the record to support that reading: the suspensions, the blacklisting after the MGM verdict, the critics who reviewed her figure rather than her performance for the better part of 2 decades. But the more interesting version of the story, and the truer one, is less about villains than about a single stubborn act of authorship repeated for 50 years. Every time an industry tried to develop her image without her in the darkroom, she found some way back into the room, refusing the nude scene, refusing the role that reduced her to an object, suing the studio that lied about why it fired her, building a business out of the one asset nobody could take from her. She did not always win. She did not, by her own admission, ever fully escape the print that made her famous. But she never once stopped insisting that there was more in the negative than the one frame the world kept choosing to develop, and that insistence, far more than any single photograph, is the actual portrait of who she was. What really happened to Raquel Welch is not one betrayal or one scandal. It is a woman who spent 5 decades trying to get the rest of the picture developed, fighting an industry that had already decided which frame it preferred, and a photograph that outlived her exactly the way it was designed to.